Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Clifford Ando, professor at the University of Chicago, and he teaches classics and history. And he's here to talk to us about citizenship in the 2nd century in Rome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The title of your book here is Roman and Local Citizenship in the Long 2nd Century CE. Why do you call this the long 2nd century? What does it have to do with citizenship?
Well, there are a number of significant turning points in the history of citizenship in the Roman Empire, of which the most famous comes in the year 212, when the Roman Emperor Caracalla, for reasons that are still somewhat hard to discern, universalized Roman citizenship and effectively transformed the Roman Empire from a world in which there were citizens and subjects into a world of universal citizens. And the story we wanted to tell begins about a century before that, but leads up to 212. But
I see.
212 isn't a convenient round number, so it's a long 2nd century.
So it's the evolution of the concept and how it's applied. Just to get started here, I'm curious about this. If you take away all of the technology that we have today and you transported someone from 2022 America back to Rome or somewhere in the Roman Empire and gave them the ability to speak Latin, right?
A non-trivial task.
Would they, I mean, are things basically similar to the way we think about them now in terms of relationships and what we think of in terms of citizenship, or would they have a really hard time adjusting?
One quick answer is that they'd probably have an easier time adjusting than you might think. There are aspects of the social system which are very foreign to us. Right. It was an empire, and both at the level of the difference between Roman citizens and others, but also in the difference between free and slave. It was a very hierarchical society with actually a lot of violence. Yeah. That said, one reason why it would be easy for a modern person to blend in as a kind of, if you were parachuted into the Roman world, is despite this insistence on legal difference, they developed almost no technologies of something like identification. There were no passports, no driver's licenses. So there was a kind of very weird mix of insisting on difference in the absence of being able to affirm legal status.
Yeah, I think there was something in the book about the ongoing efforts of the government to try to track what people were doing and things. I suppose that has something to do with this.
Yeah, there was something like a sincere desire to know how many people there were, know their status, make sure that the people who got married had the right to get married. But this often consisted of, taking lists at specific moments in time. You do a census, and you'd know at 101 169th Avenue, Cliff Ando lived at this house. But what if he moved? Or a child was born to this couple on this date. Well, the name on the list, I mean, if somebody came along 21 years later and said, I'm the guy who was born here, there was simply nothing to attach that person to verify that claim. So there was
no passports or driver's licenses, right?
And no continuous documentation. So on the one hand, there's a kind of endless production of documents without there being tethered to reality in a significant way.
Interesting. So let's talk about how the concept of citizenship changed and how the laws changed. So you started out looking at this around 196, I think.
96, yeah.
Yeah, 96, yes, I'm sorry, yeah. Sure. I'm adding a century to it.
Yeah.
So what happened then, and what are the steps along the way here?
96 is not perhaps a significant moment in the history of citizenship. It is the moment of a transformation in the government at Rome. A previous dynasty falls and a new set of emperors come in charge. In the year 212, as I said, the Romans universalized citizenship, and the Romans had various kinds of mechanisms or standard moments in time and classes of people to whom they gave citizenship as a matter of course. People who served in the army and were, as we would say, honorably discharged, for example,
Yeah.
were given citizenship as a reward. And there's kind of long been a question. There's been kind of a question, what difference did Roman citizenship actually make to its bearers? We're probably all familiar with the story of Paul. It's told in the book of Acts.
Yes, he's being arrested, and
Yeah.
he says, wait, I'm a citizen, right, of
Yeah,
Rome.
and somewhat miraculously, but almost undoubtedly as a reflection of a very significant reality, the Roman soldiers, as kind of representatives of Roman authorities, do not beat him. They just stop. And in fact, actually, coming back to the point we were making before, he doesn't have any proof. He doesn't
Right.
doesn't rip out a driver's license. Right. They take it at face value that the claim is true, or at least worth respecting until it could be verified or disproved.
And they're kind of surprised.
Yes, they're quite surprised. I mean, Roman citizenship was spread unevenly. There were many more bearers of it in the West than the East, and overall across the empire, not very many in that day.
Yeah.
So then, the question is, between something like the age of Paul and 212, what is the trajectory? It's a story that clearly has great importance to history, but with relatively few kind of big turning points. So it's worthy of kind of a detailed historical study.
Yeah. So the law, to some extent, separated people. The laws of citizenship,
Right.
to some extent, it joined them. What were the distinctions between people who were citizens and people who weren't?
Different systems of taxation, different kinds of fiscal obligations attached to subjects versus citizens. They were bound by different systems of family law, and perhaps most interestingly, I think one of the things that we now know, thanks to one of my co-authors better than ever before, is has to do with control of property. Roman citizens had to write a particular kind of will, and they could only leave their property to Roman citizens. Oh. They could, however, receive property from others. So there is a way in which, if you conceived of the body of Roman citizens as a collective, rules on transfer of property at death sort of arranged things so that property flowed into the Roman citizen body but did not flow out.
Yeah.
There would be a kind of, it's as if they imagined a kind of inexorable process in which the Romans would gradually profit from others.
So it just starts out that you pretty much need to be born a Roman citizen, and then eventually they're letting spouses attain citizenship, and there are ways that slaves could attain citizenship or not.
When Romans freed their slaves, under many circumstances, not universally true, but under an extraordinary range of circumstances, when Romans freed their slaves, they became citizens. With the disability, or as it were, that first generation freed persons had certain kind of legal constraints about property and about whether they could actually run for office. But their children were full Roman citizens. And other commentators around the Mediterranean, some Greek writers expressed astonishment. How could you make your slaves equal to yourselves? And that it seems...
Of course, a lot of their slaves were Greek.
Yeah, that's also true. It seems rather amazingly, across the long history of the Roman Empire, to have been questioned by almost no one, at least among the Romans.
Yeah.
That of course, when you free your slaves, they should become citizens, and a really historically amazing percentage of their slaves were freed.
Now, this is during the period of the Roman Empire, right? It seems odd to me that they're still putting such emphasis on that when really your privileges as a voting citizen are really not what they used to be when Rome really was established, right?
Yeah. That is, you're absolutely right, an amazing transformation whose effects are very hard to detect. At some moment, Rome goes from being, it's not an instant transformation, but at some moment Rome goes from being something like a republic, in which a significant aspect of citizenship is agency. you have political power. You vote. You vote for officials, magistrates, and you vote for laws. And that more or less comes to an end over a quarter century period. Someone hard.
So this didn't all happen at once when Caesar crossed the Rubicon?
No,
that didn't
not quite.
Okay.
Not quite. A few laws continued to be passed for a little while. But interestingly, right, a Roman citizen in Italy and later elsewhere, your formal legal name included not only your first name, what they called their name, and this third name, the cognomen, but you would also identify the name of your father. So you would say something like Clifford Ando, son of Albert. And you would mention
a tradition that's also carried on to some extent.
And you would mention your voting tribe, essentially something like the equivalent of something like the congressional district. You would then say Clifford Ando, son of Albert, Illinois District 1. Weird. And on a fair number of tombstones in the 2nd century, people continued to cite their voting tribe. They presumably hadn't meaningfully voted.
No, they had nothing to vote on, really, right?
Yeah. And but that kind of memory that it was Republican citizenship, that existed as a kind of ghostly memory and continues to be attested, and for reasons that are that we can only speculate. The evidence for that is, as it were, purely tombstones evidence, which speak to us in a very particular way.
Well, maybe a matter of pride and a matter of privilege as well, right? But let's talk about that a little bit. What privileges did the citizens have that others didn't have?
It seems perfectly clear that at significant moments, as with the story of Paul, right? There was an overlay, both legal and you might say violent, of Roman authority across the empire. And at significant moments in your life, this could matter. If not in a kind of systematic way, then at significant moments, at birth, death, moments of legal dispute with others, that there were moments when it would be nice to be able, as it were, to use a colloquialism, to appeal to Caesar. In that sense, the story of Paul speaks to a kind of very significant reality. We do, in a Roman novel called The Metamorphoses, and sometimes goes under the title The Golden Ass, there's a kind of picaresque novel of a person who is transformed into a donkey and wanders the countryside and witnesses. I mean, they're both stories embedded that are about the donkey, Lucius, but also embedded stories that he witnesses. And he sees Roman soldiers harassing locals and stealing their stuff. And they can do it because they're a Roman soldier. What are you going to do?
And they're not citizens.
And it invites the question whether if you'd said, hey, go do that to someone else. I'm a Roman citizen. Whether the soldier would have said, oh, sorry, hands off.
Yeah, it's sort of like in the old movies. Someone says, well, I'm an American citizen. I'm going to call the embassy. And something happens. Of course, if you do that today, you're just getting in worse trouble probably in most places. So if it wasn't voting, did it have to do with free speech a little bit? I mean, were you allowed to have more to say about things going on around you if you were a citizen?
It is certainly true, right, that the Roman Empire was divided into units, like we might think of states, called provinces. And inside these provinces, the basic unit of government was something like a city, or we might call it a city-state, a city with a territory ruled.
Yeah.
And they were given, even the subject cities were given a lot of autonomy. And they occasionally got fractious or imagined themselves, wandering off the reservation and doing something on their own. And we do have things like manuals of city government, in which Plutarch would be one.
Yeah.
He wags his finger and says, "You young people today, you're always trying to pass resolutions. Your little municipal council, your city government, or you can imagine, like some small town in Michigan shaking its fist at Governor Whitmer and these trials and things that just took place, and he says you're always trying to do crazy stuff and pass resolutions in government, and you need to be more quiescent, because the Romans basically leave us alone, but they're capable of not leaving us alone.
Yes.
And that you don't want.
And there are many examples of that. Yes.
Yeah. And but over time, of course, some number, and this is one of the more interesting features of citizenship, over time, some number of these members of the kind of social elite in all of these places probably became Roman citizens. So there was, gradually a kind of an interpenetration of the two, of these populations throughout. One of the more interesting things that you could say about, not simply in Greek intellectuals of this period, but even perhaps by the end of the 2nd century, many of the social elites in, say, of the Jewish population would have been Roman citizens. It's a kind of, until quite recently, a kind of unspoken aspect of the study of Jewish literature, of the Mishnah, and particularly of the Talmud, that it was probably written by Roman citizens. I mean, almost undoubtedly, in the 3rd century, all of these Jews writing in essence normative texts for other Jews were Roman citizens.
Interesting. Yeah, I think about St. Paul again. It just occurred to me. He also says at one point, "I'm a citizen of no mean city," and he's of course referring to the city of heaven, I guess, right? So it actually comes up twice for him. It must have been on his mind, right? I mean, he pulled it twice. You say, I don't know if it's on the dust jacket or something I read, that this is a radical new interpretation of Roman history.
Right,
What's different about what we're reading in this book and what we would have seen or what we'd have thought of if we studied this 100 years ago or 10 years ago?
The quickest answer is that eventually the Romans give citizenship to everyone, more or less. And a lot of later history was written in such a way that that endpoint, in which everyone is a citizen, must have been what the Romans were aspiring to do all along. So there's a fair number of histories of this period and of the concept of citizenship that treat the Romans as if they had always had this kind of thing as a project. We're going to transform the world, and then we'll just make everyone Roman. We'll make everyone culturally Roman, and then all of a sudden we'll just make everyone into Roman citizens.
Yeah.
And it was in the last sort of decade that my collaborator in this book, Miles, did probably, by some significant margin, the best quantitative attempt to pose the question on the day before, as it were, like on the day before the universalization of citizenship, how many Roman citizens were there? And, a very good guess would be something like a third. So the universalization of citizenship was not, as it were, just the last capstone of an inevitable process. It was actually a kind of revolutionary act. But that raised the question, if it's only a third, then for the last 100 years or so before it, citizenship was actually not meaningless. It was a marker of difference. Well, what were the areas of life in which it did make a difference?
Yeah. Well, and that, of course, is what you're talking about in the text there. So some other examples of that, of the differences. Actually, I want something else I wanted to mention before we go back to that.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if they were trying to, or intending to, or at least like the idea of making everyone a citizen, that's not Romans as exploiters, is it? That's Romans as trying to make people join the club and trying to pass on their take on civilization to these other, as they would put it, less privileged peoples, right? Do you think that was true? I mean, at least that much of it was true that they?
Yeah, actually, that over the last kind of generation or two has become a much contested concept, and I think I'm probably in a distinct minority in affirming that I think that was actually a very large part of the project for some Romans.
Yeah, because I think the United States saw itself that way in the 20th century, right? So that's not hard to understand.
Both aspects of that, both of these recent topics, right? That Rome gave away citizenship and that they did it because they had transformed the world, regardless of whether the Romans themselves meant it, that became an incredibly important legacy to Europe, right? Subsequent European empires, because of the prestige of Rome, always claimed to be imitating Rome. And if you were going to imitate Rome, you had to have, as a project, the cultural transformation and ultimately the universalization of something like, well, I know what you metropolitan citizenship.
Yeah.
And some number of the empires, in some significant ways, the Spanish and the British Empire both came a cropper because they had, in some way, advertised themselves as like Rome, but at the last minute were simply, the whole thing fell apart because they weren't going to universalize.
And they were exploitive.
Yeah,
right? I mean, given the option, they were exploitive. Yeah.
So in many ways, the importance of Rome in later history has to do with kind of a certain kind of historical memory that doesn't even need to be true to be important.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think maybe that goes back to their attempt to sort of emulate what Alexander, what the Greeks were doing, because whether Alexander intended to or not, maybe you know more about this, he certainly spread Greek culture around the world, right?
Absolutely.
So you think that was kind of an influence on their sense of who they were and what they were about?
Yes. It's true. It's true in two significant senses. It's true in the one sense that the speed and extent of Alexander's conquest remained a kind of significant memory in the ancient world.
Yeah.
I mean, hugely influential.
It's still pretty impressive today.
Interestingly, after Alexander's death, almost entirely the work of kind of thinkers and philosophers in the Roman period, they began to think of Alexander as having aspired to kind of unite all the people that he had conquered in a kind of single polity.
Yeah. Well, there's some evidence of that. I think I read that when he finished conquering the world, he only had 300 of his original soldiers left, and the rest of that army are people that he had turned. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I don't think the number 300 is correct, but it is absolutely true that that he recruited at various levels of kind of what you might think of as the structure, both soldiers and elites. He recruited along the way, and famously appears to have, that the story is told that he wanted significant intermarriage between Macedonian officers and locals. I was going to say later people looking back imagined Alexander as having aspired to unify the world, and in that sense, the image of Alexander, what they, you might say, knew in quotation marks, what they thought they knew of Alexander was at least, if not more potent than any kind of factual basis to these stories. No one would question the notion. There was no revisionist history of Alexander in the ancient world.
Yeah. Well, so if we look at the very beginning here of the early conquest, the Punic Wars, Caesar and Gaul, do you think this was a factor then? Because this was when it was still the Republic, right?
Right. Yeah.
Did it hold more value? Did people desire to be Roman citizens more during that period? Obviously, they were fighting them. Right. They weren't volunteering to be taken over. But
there are two significant states. The quick answer to your question is absolutely. But there was a very, very early history in which, as the Romans tell it in the 6th, 5th century, so early Republic, when the Romans conquered other peoples, they imposed citizenship on them and gave it to them whether they wanted or not.
Oh, interesting.
And as citizens of a kind of liberal lowercase L world in which your citizenship what makes you American, and other people have their own citizenship. The notion that after war you just give citizenship whether they want it or not is it's not how we think of citizenship. Otherwise, if that's what we did, we wouldn't be wrestling with the question of what to do with undocumented immigrants. Yeah. Later, the Romans became very more exclusive about their citizenship, and it's clear that some of their allies, the Romans ultimately fought a war with their allies over, as the story is conventionally told, over essentially a demand by some of their allies. If you want us to keep fighting in your wars, come on, hand it over. Precisely because in that period, what you might say, the fruits of empire were being asymmetrically distributed.
Yeah, interesting.
Romans and allies went to war, but the benefits went to the Romans.
Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Clifford Ando for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.